This is the Pastor Podcast with Randy and Andy. Andy Payton is the lead pastor at Methodist Temple United Methodist Church in Evansville, Indiana. Randy Moore is associate pastor at Methodist Temple. Their goal is to see Christ in everything and everyone.
Welcome in, friends. I'm Randy of the Randy and Andy Podcast. As always, joined by the Andy. Good to see you, Pastor Andy.
Hello, it's good to be with everyone, and I guess I'm the Andy of the Pastor Podcast.
Yeah, I always look forward to this time together. I was going to say this hour. We haven't hit an hour yet. We might still, but it's always good. And we are approaching Holy Week. We're winding down the season of Lent. And so, wow, the 2024 is off and running.
Yes. Well, if Lent is spring training for Christians, then Holy Week is like the Super Bowl
right.
of the Christian year. It's the highest and holiest time. And, of course, we remember the final events of Jesus' life here on earth. It's a Holy Week. It's a busy week, but it's a good week, too.
It really is. It's the best week and all week long, and we'll talk about that a little bit too. But you've been in a series on the cross, atonement or At-One-Ment, and understanding the cross. You want to give us the quick rundown of the first three episodes, and before we dig into number 4, what we're going to talk about this week?
Sure. For the last few weeks, we've been looking at the cross and taking a look at the death of Jesus from different angles. In the first sermon, I talked about how the cross proves God's love to us. In the second sermon, I talked about how Jesus' sacrifice invites our sacrifice into God. And then on the third installment of the series, we talked about the cross in terms of Jesus confronting the spiritual forces of wickedness and evil, and then, of course, overcoming them. And then last weekend, we ended the series by talking about the cross calling forth our own transformation. We're called to die to an old way of life, an old way of being, and adopt a new way of being in light of what has happened on the cross.
Mm-hmm. And it is the great mystery of our faith, right? That Jesus died, and what looked like defeat somehow was victory. And so you've taken the time, and we've taken the time as a congregation to take a look at that. And so how can we see something that seems on the face of it so tragic and so final, at least in that moment? What effect does that have? And it's the question of the ages, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's the question that we put before us every weekend as we gather for worship as Christians. And I think I've said this before in the podcast, Randy, but Christianity at its core is not about death avoided or pain avoided. Instead, it's about death and pain transformed. And so the cross is not just an event of the past, it's an event of the present into the future. It's the lens that we as Christians adopt and we try to see the world through. And so it's so important, and that's why we talk about the cross. We spend a lot of time on death and pain, because those are things we a lot of time want to avoid. We want to act like that's not a part of our lives, and we run from those things. But the cross doesn't invite us to do that. We face them with faith.
You know, every time I pray in a hospital setting or an at-home setting, I refer to the fact that it's because of Jesus' suffering that we don't suffer alone.
Right.
And none of us wants to bring on suffering. It's just that it comes with the package. It does. That's not defeatist. It's just life, and it's exhibited on the cross.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, it's the price we pay for being human. It's the price we pay for being finite. In some sense, suffering is the price we pay for loving too. We suffer when we love because that person eventually is going to be taken from us, and we know that. And so, it's at the core of what it means to be alive. Is part of that is suffering, as well. The Buddhists would talk about that, and other traditions talk about that, how what we do with our suffering, how we respond to our suffering is at the core of our well-being as human beings.
And one of the difficulties, or one of the challenges with fully appreciating the cross, is that we're Easter people. Mm-hmm. We're post-Easter, and so what we're doing is a exercise, or it's a rehearsal, or it's kind of a imaginative forgetting that we're Easter people for a minute. But I have found it to be, and I am absolutely an Easter person, but I have found it to be difficult to fully engage in the practices of Lent because we know.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, we know the end of the story, so to speak. And so why do I want to live through these hard things? Why do I want to go through this depressing stuff?
Yeah.
As an Easter people, we're like, well, I already know how this is going to work out. And well, I think we miss some things, of course, if we do that. So
yeah, and I think it would be helpful if we talk about the fact that we're going to go from Palm Sunday this Sunday to Easter the next Sunday, and a certain percentage of our people and a certain percentage of our culture at large will just skip right over every day between those two Sundays. And I've always encouraged people, because I was encouraged as a layperson by one pastor in particular, please take advantage of the midweek services. They're so important. They're so important to the whole story. Because if you go from Palm Sunday, which is also, in a sense, celebratory, at least the first part of it is, to Easter, then you miss what we've been talking about. And certain churches have handled it in various ways. And I know here at Methodist Temple, we do a Palm Sunday. Some churches do a Palm Passion Sunday, which is just kind of an understanding of the reality that not all of your people are going to be there for the Passion on Friday. Mm-hmm. And we did this back at Baker Chapel. We did a Palm and a Passion, knowing that we wanted the people to get Good Friday, and we had to give it to them on Sunday. Mm-hmm. So it's an interesting challenge.
Impose Good Friday upon the people because we know they're going to skip it. Yeah.
Yeah.
So one way I love to think about Holy Week, and I always bring this up every time we get close to Holy Week, is that within the events of Holy Week, we also see the events and the seasons of our own lives. And let me explain what I mean by that. So on Palm Sunday, of course, it's a big celebration. Jesus parades into Jerusalem. The world is cheering him on. On Thursday, he has his Last Supper with his disciples. And we get the sense that, when's the next shoe going to drop? On Good Friday, all hell breaks loose. He's executed, he dies. And then on Easter, of course, he rises from the dead. Now, within those four events, what we see is the seasons of our own lives. We have those moments and seasons in our lives when it feels like life is cheering us on. We have those seasons in our lives where we find ourselves thinking, hey, when's the next shoe going to drop? We have those seasons in our life when the world breaks our hearts and we're crucified. And then, of course, we have those seasons in our life when we rise from the dead. We rise to new life. And what we find in those seasons is the pattern that God works within our lives. And for me, that's why this is we call it Holy Week. The word holy means to set apart. This week is set apart because it tells us the deepest truth of our lives. It tells us, it reveals to us how God's love is working in our lives. And we don't have to avoid certain things in our lives now because, like you said, we're never alone. God is with us, and this is how God works.
Yeah, we actually see that in Scripture, in all of Scripture, like the prophets. The prophets have they're varied in their messages and in their approach, and when they were prophesying. But if you look at Isaiah and you look at Jeremiah and you look at Ezekiel, there's judgment, and then there's restoration. Mm-hmm. So you can't get hung up on the judgment and not realize that the restoration comes later, or go right to the end of the book and say it's all restoration. Mm-hmm. It's what we're talking about. There is judgment because there's a problem. There's a problem, but then in the end, the end is a hopeful end, and there's the restoration. And we've talked about it with the Psalms as well. I didn't really appreciate this until I took a bit of a deeper dive on the Psalms. But even the Psalms of lament have a turn of praise. After the complaint, there's a turn of praise. Why? Because they know that God is there somewhere. God just seems distant. And then when God shows back up, boom, there's a turn to praise, even in the laments. Mm-hmm. So that scheme it's there as well. Mm-hmm. This death and then life.
Well, it's the eternal pattern of God. Jesus is the eternal pattern of God being disclosed to the world. Yeah. It's the good news of God's love being disclosed to the world. In fact, in the New Testament, there are some lines like that. I think it's in like 1 Timothy or something like that. Don't have a Bible in front of me here, but I'm pretty sure. It says literally, the eternal pattern of God's grace is disclosed in the good news of Jesus Christ. And so, yeah, you're going to see that in the Psalms. You're going to see that in the prophets. This is not something new in the sense, this is always how God has worked, and God confirms it in Holy Week. God confirms it on the cross and Easter. Yeah. And so, it's just beautiful stuff. I get excited about it. Because it's just the center of the gospel. It's the center of the faith.
Okay, your text for this week came from Galatians, and we'll say right up front that, this text, there are other texts that you could have used in the message that you gave in the wrap-up of this sermon series on the cross and what it means. And you're talking this week about how the cross calls for our own transformation. But we'll read your text, and it's interesting because it actually includes a line that was a big part of the last time in my sermon, the last time I preached here. But it comes from Galatians in the 2nd chapter, verses 19 and 20. Of course, this is the Apostle Paul writing to a group of churches in what would be modern-day southern Turkey. It was called Galatia. We think this is not just a one church; it's to several. And he takes them to task. This is the angry Paul in Galatians. He's upset with them. But this is beautiful here in 19 and 20 of the 2nd chapter. He says, "For through the law I died to the law, so that I might live to God. I have been crucified with Christ, and it is no longer I who live, but it is Christ who lives in me. And the life I now live in the flesh, I live by the faith of the Son of God, who loved me and gave himself for me." You can see exactly why you chose that, because Paul looks to the cross and says, I too am crucified with Christ.
It's a symbol of his own transformation.
There you go.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think to understand this, you have to look at it through the lens of Paul's own conversion, though. He, of course, was a persecutor of the early church, a persecutor of Christians, and has a revelation, really. Something happens to Paul.
Right.
Let's just say it.
Right.
Some sort of mystical moment, Damascus Road experience happens to Paul where he sees differently. He sees Christ in them. And then he, as a result of that revelation, he changes everything. His whole way of relating to God, his whole way of understanding what it means to be faithful to God. He's still Jewish, but he sees it entirely different. And I think it's encapsulated in these verses. He says, I died to the law, and now I live to God, and I've been crucified with Christ. Christ is the one that lives in me. And it's just really good stuff right here.
It is, and it makes you wonder, where did Paul get his stuff? Was his stuff handed down to him, or did his stuff come from Jesus in that moment, and then that's what gives him his authority to say what he's saying about his gospel or the gospel of Jesus, or the good news? That was, he seems very, very confident in it. And the Jerusalem church didn't seem to have any issues with it. They had their issues, but they still appreciated what he was doing among the Gentiles.
Mm-hmm. I don't know. I'm going to have to say I don't.
Me too. Yeah.
Paul derives his understanding of God's will from his own personal experiences, but then he also derives his understanding of God's will from the Torah, the Hebrew Bible. But then he also, I would argue, derives his understanding of God's will through what we would call today natural law, by looking at the world around him and believing God is working through the world around him. It's clear that he does that at times. And so Paul's a mix, kind of like we are, and he's a complicated figure. And to just pin him down and say, that's Paul, that's just never going to work if you've ever studied him very much.
Well, especially through the history of interpretation, it changes and will continue to change our understanding of Paul and everything that he wrote. Okay, yeah, good. So that was the text for the sermon. And you talked about the fact that the invitation of the gospel is to trade the old way of living and the old way of seeing the world for a new way of living and a new way of seeing the world. And you spent your sermon talking about the old way and then the new way.
Yeah, it's just, I tried to be as simple as I could about this is what the transformation is meant to look like in a person's life as they become more and more Christianized or christened, as we become more centered in Christ. And so I began my sermon talking about, though, what's the old way of being that we need to die to? And classically speaking, the old way of being, of course, is a life rooted in sin. Now, I readily admit sin can be a dirty word for some people who especially have been brought up in a religious situation where sin is a word that has been used to beat people up and put people down. And I see that. I want to say to folks, I understand that. I know where you're coming from is if you experience sin in a negative way. But the word sin to me is like a way of being in the world. It's a sense of being cut off. It's a sense of the world looks flat. It's no longer enchanted anymore. That's how I would describe sin. And sin's plural, so sin singular is a way of being. Sin's plural is the conscious choices that we make as a result of our way of seeing the world. And as we go along the podcast, I hope this will make more sense. But so sin singular is a way of being. It's our lens. Sin's plural are the conscious choices we make as a result of our way of being, our lens. And a story I told is one that I've told and retold over the years. It comes from Parker Palmer. I told this in my sermon. And Palmer is a wonderful Christian writer. I recommended in my sermon to read his book, Let Your Life Speak. I come back to that book, actually, from time to time. It's really good. But he tells a story of a little girl who welcomes her baby brother home for the first time. She's 3 years old, so she's been at the center of her parents' attention her entire life. And her baby brother comes home for the first time from the hospital, and she has an odd request. She wants to be alone with her baby brother. And of course the parents are like, no, that's not a great idea. And they finally concede. They lay the baby in the crib. The little girl walks up to the crib and then asks him a question. Tell me about God, she says. I've almost forgot. And it's an evocative story, provocative story, because it does encapsulate something we've all gone through as we've grown older in this world. And when we enter this world, we have a sense of God. We have a sense we come from God. But over a period of time, through our socialization, what happens is that enchantment begins to die off, and that enchantment begins to go away. Now, when I say we come in this world, we have a sense of God, I'm not saying that we're like theologians. We don't have like fully developed beliefs yet. But the way I would describe it is when we enter this world as kids, we have a sense of like the aliveness of life. We have a curiosity about life. We have a curiosity about people and the world around us. We get excited, and life really does have this charge of energy to it. But over a period of time, what happens is we are cultured in a certain way where that's no longer the case. And that's kind of like a fall into sin. That's what I'm trying to describe when I talk about a mode of being. We're falling into sin when we fall as that little girl in that story fell, even at a very, very early age.
Yeah, I love your sermons. I really do. But the most favorite part of the service for me, I think I may have said this before, is when the children come back into the sanctuary during the final song. And they're smiling, and they're skipping, and they're singing, and they're holding on to the project, and they're looking for their parents, and then when their eyes eye up when they find them, and they go to their parents, and we just are too dignified to skip and sing and dance in front of people.
We don't do that anymore.
Yeah,
we're cultured out of it. It's been beaten out of us, really.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The other story, I haven't told this one in a long time, but it was on a Palm Sunday. And so my son was with the kids in the palm processional, and I look around, and they're coming down, waving their palms, and my son has his flipped into an air guitar, and he's just dancing and playing air guitar with his palm all the way down the aisle. And I'm
beautiful.
like, there it is.
That's it.
There it is.
Unless you become as a child, you'll never enter the kingdom of God. You're going to miss what Jesus is talking about.
Yeah.
And it's so simple, but yet very, very difficult to get there.
It is.
Because Frederick Buechner, wonderful theologian, another person I would suggest if you want to read someone that just has a lot of depth, Buechner's a good one. He talks about how we experience our world from the outside in rather than inside out. What's he mean by that? Well, when we're living from the outside in, we're always worried about what's happening around us. We're always worried about what people are thinking about us. We're always thinking about, do I measure up? Am I good enough? Do I appear the right ways? That's adulthood in the Western world. And I would argue that's much of religion today. Mm-hmm. Much of religion today is based upon this notion of the outside in. Am I measuring up? Do I believe the right way? Am I doing the right stuff? It's the tyranny of the performance principle. It's everything that Paul's preaching against in the lesson we read today. Everything. And getting out of that in a big way is what conversion is about. We're realizing, hey, my core identity, who I am, is not based upon what other people think about me. It's based upon what God thinks about me. And once we get there, boy, there's a liberation for sure.
The best thing I ever did for my own mental health, and this has been years ago, is to stop. I'm going to say caring, and then I'm going to qualify that, but to stop caring about what other people think. Now, I do care about people, but you understand what I mean. It was freeing, so freeing.
It takes a lot of discipline.
Yeah.
To do that. It really does. But I mean, I love one of the clearest paths to happiness that I've ever heard about or has been taught to me is this notion of you let go of the things you cannot control, and you control and do the things you can. And that's in my sermon at the end, I talked about the serenity prayer, but I'll just hit on it right now. Well, what is something we can't control? We cannot control what people think about us. We cannot control how they respond to us. And yet we live for the applause. And as pastors, we're probably as guilty of this as anyone. We're public figures. I'm as guilty of this as anyone. I get up and preach a sermon and I think, what did people think about it? Did they like it? Did they enjoy it? And that kind of stuff. But we all are doing it, right? We're all worrying about what other people think. And we're trying to control something we cannot control. And that is, folks, the responses to us, the way they think about us. Now, to be able to let that go, as you just said, that is a huge liberation. I mean, talk about well-being.
Yes.
I'm no longer doing that.
Okay, so you went there. We'll come back to some of the old. You skipped right into the new, Andy. That's just how you are. You went right to the good news.
I'm doing the Easter thing, right?
Yeah, there you go. There you go. There you go. I did not know the Serenity Prayer was longer than the one most of us are familiar with, so I've printed out the entire prayer. I'm just going to go ahead and read it. Is that okay?
Let me give you a little history on this before you read it. So the Serenity Prayer does go back to Reinhold Niebuhr. Niebuhr, I think, got that from somewhere else, but that's how these things go. The first part of the Serenity Prayer, the one that's most common to people, it probably goes back to Niebuhr. Some form of it goes actually back to Niebuhr. The longer form of the Serenity Prayer, actually, I think it came out of the recovery community. They added this on, but I think it really does capture the spirit of what the Serenity Prayer is trying to speak to. And so the whole thing together really does give a helpful picture of what it looks like to live into the Christian life.
Absolutely. So here it is, the Serenity Prayer. God, give me grace to accept with serenity the things that cannot be changed, courage to change the things which should be changed, and the wisdom to distinguish the one from the other, living one day at a time, enjoying one moment at a time, accepting hardship as a pathway to peace, taking, as Jesus did, this sinful world as it is, not as I would have it, trusting that you will make all things right if I surrender to your will, so that I may be reasonably happy in this life and supremely happy with you forever in the next. Amen.
It's beautiful.
That's really good stuff.
The line that pops out for me from the second half is accepting hardship as a pathway to peace. That's so difficult though, right? Because our tendency is to become enraged. Our tendency is to ruminate. Hold on. We get possessed by hardship. And it's saying there, what is it? Accepting hardship as the pathway to peace. I accept that I cannot control this. And that comes in so many different forms. And yet, how much of our time, if I was honest with myself, if the listeners were honest with themselves, how much of our time is actually spent stirring things that you cannot control out, like the hardships of our lives?
Well, that Buechner stuff was great, but he must have ended up on the cutting room floor because it didn't make it into the sermon. I mean, there's only so much we can do in a sermon, but thank you for including that. That's one of the reasons why we do the podcast. But you brought in Marcus Borg, so let's back up again. Let's back into the old, and that's the way life goes.
You're just not going to let me get out of there. Really.
Right. That's life, right?
I want to go to Easter, man. Let's go.
There we go.
So Marcus Borg, he has a very helpful way of understanding the culture that we are saturated with in the Western world, and he calls it the 3 A's: appearance, affluence, and achievement. Do I appear the right way? Do I have enough stuff? Have I got to that place where I'm successful? And it is just like he's talking about the same thing Buechner's talking about, that we're living from the outside in. We're living in constant comparison. And this sort of socialization, while it's taking us in a lot of good places as a culture, I'm not going to say it's all bad. What it has done, though, is it's left us competitive, isolated, and suspicious of one another. And right now in our world, we have an epidemic of isolation. Depression's going up. Anxiety's going up. Our young people particularly are struggling with feeling cut off and disconnected. And mental health is just not real great for our world right now. And so what I would argue is the farther and farther we've gone down this path of what I'm describing as sin, a way of being in the world where we lost enchantment, the farther and farther we go down that path, the more we lose a sense of joy, right? We lose a sense of fulfillment and contentment. And it's undeniable, really. You look around and you see this kind of the cut off faces of, that's not the right way to say it. You walk around and there seems like something's off. Mm-hmm. Yeah. In our world. I think it's a better way to put it.
Yeah. Okay, let's jump back into the new, because you were talking about Reinhold Niebuhr. And was it Niebuhr who talked about the 3 ways of seeing the world? Yeah.
That comes from Reinhold Niebuhr. Responsible self.
That's yeah.
And so what Niebuhr really does in a very practical way is he points out how the lens and the worldview that we adopt, the way we see the world, influences the type of people we become. It influences our behavior. And so he has 3 different categories, different lenses that we see the world through. And the first lens, he says, is there is a tendency for some of us to see the world through the lens of hostility and fear. When we look out at the world, we think it's an evil place. It's out to get us. And I can see why people would get into that pattern. Life didn't go well for us, maybe. Or we just look around and there's tragedy and there's violence and there's unemployment and people are hurting. And so we get to that place where we think, well, my default setting is the world is a hostile place. It's a fearful place. And in the sermon, I talked about how fear-based religion becomes so tempting for this worldview. We have a fear-based worldview. We have a fear-based God. And the two go hand in hand. And so basically what happens sometimes is preachers and people of faith will come alongside that fear and they'll sanctify it. They'll say, well, yeah, there's a lot to be afraid of, and you should be afraid of God too. And they're like, well, see, I knew it, And,
right.
But notice what happens if that's our worldview. We become defensive. We become protective. We become suspicious of the other. We're going to fail to love in the way that Jesus described it, really. That's the first way. The second way, Niebuhr talked about our lens. The second lens, really, is the lens of, he called it indifference. It's not that the world is hostile or evil. The world and the universe around us is just indifferent. We're a collection of molecules and energy forces that have evolved over billions of years, and basically we're just lucky to be here. And the universe is just not interested in our dreams and our hopes and our aspirations. It's just like, well, you're here, It's the modern secular worldview, really, is what he's getting at here. And what humanity becomes in the indifferent category is we're like players on a stage, and it's up to us to create our own stories. And so what happens in that second category is, while we're not quite as hostile, we still feel like it's our responsibility to control things. It's our responsibility to articulate our story and force our story upon the world around us. And of course, that's going to lead to some frustration because that's never going to work. You're never going to be able to just implement your story the way you want it on the world around us. And so, again, it leads us to becoming a little bit less hostile or less defensive, less protective, but protective nonetheless. And then there's the last lens that Niebuhr mentions, and that is we see the world as life-giving, nourishing, embracing. To use a theological term, it's gracious. The word gracious is derived from the Christian term grace. It's gracious. And that's kind of what Jesus was talking about, I think, when he saw the world. You see it in the Sermon on the Mount. There's moments in the Sermon on the Mount where Jesus is like, well, look at the birds, God takes care of them. And look at how God sends rain on the just and the unjust. Even the people who've missed the mark, Jesus is like, God's even gracious to them. And so Jesus is inviting us into this more gracious worldview. But notice how that changes the way we interact with the world. When we have a gracious worldview, we respond in a gracious way. Of course, someone's going to be thinking at this point, that sounds good, but that's naive. Niebuhr was not naive. He knew about the Holocaust. He knew about systemic evil. He knew about racism, all the things that we know about when we think of ways to believe that the world is a fearful place, all those things. But he also understood that the reason behind the things that we're doing, the lens that we're using, could deeply impact our sense of well-being and fulfillment. I used the analogy of social justice in the sermon. I've seen people work for social justice out of a place of outrage. I've seen people work for social justice to change the world because they feel like it's our world to control it. But then I've seen people work for social justice out of a place of faith, trust. They're in love with life. The world around them is gracious, and life is sacred, needs to be protected. They're coming from that place. That person that comes to my mind is Desmond Tutu. He fought, right? He fought the powers that be, but he did it with joy. And that's what we need in our world today. We need that confidence again. And so the cross, back to the cross, is the shortcut to finding that sense of the third option that Niebuhr's talking about. It proves God's love. It is a confrontation with the forces of evil. It says they do not have the final word. It invites our sacrifice. We sacrifice ourselves to that vision of reality, that vision of God, and it makes all the difference in the world.
Then you ask the question, how do we get there?
Right.
How do we get there? You bring the Apostle Paul back in and his idea of the obedience of faith, which comes from the letter to the Romans, 16th chapter, the 26th verse. It is now disclosed, and through the prophetic writings it is made known to all the Gentiles, according to the command of the eternal God, to bring about the obedience of faith.
And obedience is like sin. It can be interpreted as a dirty word. But the way I use the obedience of faith that Paul is talking about here, I'm convinced, is that a person has given up on the tyranny of the performance principle. I'm no longer trying to live my life by constantly trying to measure up. Instead, I'm going to adopt the worldview that's given to me in Jesus Christ. I'm going to see this world as a gracious place. I'm going to see God as a loving God. God is with me. God is for me. In Romans 8:28, I think we get a very simple and straightforward articulation about what the obedience of faith really is. We trust that all things work together for good as we love God. And so our worldview, our attitude, that's it. That's what Paul's getting at. And that changes us when we adopt that. And that's what it really means to live our life under the shadow of the cross. We know that evil does not have the final word over us. We know that death does not have the final word over us. These things happen, but we don't have to give them the finality that typically we do.
Yeah. And then you ended your sermon, as you always do, with the practical application, in fact, a practice that you recommended our people employ.
Yeah, the question is, what's God loving in this moment? How's God loving in this person? And that's the obedience of faith. I'm adopting a different worldview, a different attitude. It's actually the one thing we can't control.
Yeah.
Yep.
Good. All right, this Sunday, Palm Sunday, I'll be preaching. I'm going to put you on the spot here. I meant to call you and say, hey, I want you to help me work with this text. So we'll just work with it just a little bit because my sermon hasn't taken its final form yet. So I'm open. I'm going to read the lesson, It comes from Mark in the lectionary. This is the year of Mark, and so we have his description of what's known as the triumphal entry. So it's from chapter 11, beginning with verse 1 and going through the 11th verse. And it says that when they were approaching Jerusalem at Bethphage and Bethany, near the Mount of Olives, he sent 2 of his disciples and said to them, "Go into the village ahead of you, and immediately as you enter it, you will find there tied a colt that has never been ridden. Untie it and bring it. If anyone says to you, 'Why are you doing this?' just say this, 'The Lord needs it,' and will send it back here immediately." They went away and found a colt tied near a door, outside in the street. As they were untying it, some of the bystanders said to them, "What are you doing untying the colt?" They told them what Jesus had said, and they allowed them to take it. Then they brought the colt to Jesus and threw their cloaks on it, and he sat on it. Many people spread their cloaks on the road, and others spread leafy branches that they had cut in the fields. Then those who went ahead and those who followed were shouting, "Hosanna! Blessed is the one who comes in the name of the Lord. Blessed is the coming kingdom of our ancestor David. Hosanna in the highest heaven." Then he entered Jerusalem and went into the temple, and when he had looked around at everything, and it was already late, he went out to Bethany with the 12. Just your initial thoughts when you just hear it read?
Oh, well, my brain. So the first thing that I always think about when I'm reflecting on Palm Sunday is how it seems like a planned event.
Uh-huh.
It seems like they had it was like a planned demonstration, really, because he sends the disciples ahead. They get this colt. If someone asks, just tell them the Lord needs it, that kind of thing. And so there's this prearrangement to it. That's not even a word, but it's prearranged in a sense. And the next question that comes to my mind is then, okay, so why would he prearrange it? Yeah. Because if you look at some of the history of this week, there was another parade.
Right, on the other side, yeah.
On the other side. And the other parade was not Jesus. It was not someone riding a colt. It was not people waving palm branches or anything like that. It was a parade of Roman soldiers marching into the city of Jerusalem. And instead of saying, "Blessed is the one who comes in the name of the Lord," it's "Blessed is the one who comes in the name of Caesar." Mm-hmm. And this is the ultimate confrontation between the forces of good and really evil of the day. And Jesus is going into Jerusalem to deal with that. And I know it looks like rainbows and unicorns on the surface, but of course we know that's not how it works out. And that's why, because he confronts the forces of death. And it's such a courageous moment for him to do that.
Yeah, the excuse me. The current title of my sermon is "He Comes in Peace," which I always leave myself the opportunity to change that. I know you do too, depending on how my studies go and how the Spirit moves. But that's the point. He does come in peace. He is confronting evil. Mm-hmm. But he is clearly identified as confronting evil because that's why they put him to death. But he comes in peace. Mm-hmm. He doesn't come as a insurrectionist.
Nope.
But he's coming as people are not comfortable with the word king currently, but I mean that was the language of the day. He's saying, he proclaimed this at the very beginning of Mark. The kingdom is near, sure. and here comes an alternative kingdom.
Yes, the best critique of the bad is to practice the better. Jesus is practicing the better in this moment. His followers are practicing the better in this moment, and they're saying, "No, this is what God wants for us. This is who God has called us to be." This is what it looks like if God were king of this world, not Caesar. This is what it looks like. And they're doing it peacefully, but it doesn't mean they're just, laying down and letting people walk over them. They're confronting.
Right. Yeah. The other thing I find interesting is you already mentioned all the arrangements for the transportation, into Jerusalem, and it takes up half of this passage making these arrangements. Mm-hmm. So some have looked at that and said, maybe this is James and John, who were like, a couple chapters back, they're wondering whether who's going to be on the left and who's going to be on the right in the kingdom. And now they're going down there negotiating for a colt. Like, it's a very simple kind of gesture, and it's one that we can apply to today. Like, I think you and I take on a lot of responsibility for, making something happen and being true to God's word and sharing that and seeing that help people grow. And we have all these great expectations. But this is a very simple task, actually, just to go down and get the colt, Very simple. And the simple things that we do make a big, big difference.
Well, it's a symbol. It's a revelation of what obedience looks like.
Yeah.
What is obedience? It's not about some weird code. It starts with saying, what is life requiring of me now? What's required of me? Well, Jesus needs me to go ahead and help him out.
Right.
I'm gonna go.
Yeah.
I'm gonna go do that.
Yeah.
No one knows my name. We don't know who they are. No one knows who these folks are, really.
Right.
It could be James and John. It might be a couple of the other disciples. We don't even know. We can't even recall their names. They just go and do it. And that, to me, that's such a great way to think about what does it mean to live a faithful life today. I'm not doing this for the applause. I'm not doing this because I'm trying to win over people's favor. I'm doing this because I feel like this is what's required of me. This is what life is required of me. I see that I'm able to help with this, so I'm going to go do it. And I don't know. That kind of humility is hard to teach, and it's hard to cultivate in our own lives.
Well, and relatively speaking, this was a success for the disciples, who in the book of Mark in particular are kind of misunderstanding and bumbling all the way through, and they're going to desert him. But they accomplished this small thing with huge consequences, but a small thing. The other thing, and I'm not going to delve into this because it would require, bringing in the other Gospels, and that can sometimes be confusing, and you kind of like to just stick with Mark's story. But I just had to kind of go, whoa, and almost chuckle where it says, then he entered, in the 11th verse, the last one of this text, then he entered Jerusalem, went into the temple. When he looked around at everything, as it was already late, he went out to Bethany with the 12. So, in John, this is the first thing Jesus does when he gets to it happens early on in the Gospel of John. And here, and in the other synoptics, in Matthew and in Luke, Jesus enters in the last week of his life. And he goes and cleanses the temple. That's the way we've termed it. But here, when he first gets there, he just goes in and has a look around. That'd be something to toy with. Yeah, just has a look around. It's late.
He's not enraged or anything like that.
Right.
He's not angry.
Right.
Yeah. It's almost like he's getting the lay of the land.
Uh-huh.
Because we do know what's coming next. Like,
right, he is going to come
when
in.
When everyone shows up whenever it is, very soon, whenever there's a bunch of people around, he comes in and makes a scene. But, yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so this is the first scene in the last act, and from there that takes us to Jerusalem and takes us to Holy Week, which is next week. Yeah. Good. All right. Anything else, Pastor Andy?
I think we covered it all, Randy.
Okay. Well, we hope that you have a wonderful wrap up to your season of Lent, and I know that I had higher expectations for my own disciplines, but I'm not going to beat myself up, and I'm not going to beat you up. But this is that season where I can remember back on Ash Wednesday, we remember that we're dust, and to dust we shall return. And, we practice prayer, and we practice fasting, and we practice giving to the poor. And back to your analogy of spring training, just exercising those fundamentals. And so I hope it's been fruitful for you all, and I hope you have a great Holy Week, and you're certainly invited to join us here for any and all of that. So thank you so much for listening. We really do appreciate it, and we'll talk to you next week.
This has been the Pastor Podcast with Randy and Andy. You are welcome to join us at Methodist Temple in person or online. Methodist Temple is at 2109 Lincoln Avenue in Evansville, Indiana. Our traditional Sunday morning worship service is at 8:30 with our contemporary service at 11. Log on to our website at methodisttemple.church. We see Christ in you.